The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town where Ethan Cole had built his quiet life. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dew and pine trees. A few birds sang in the distance, and a thin mist drifted across the fields. This was the time of day Ethan liked most, the time when the world was silent and calm, before people filled it with noise. Ethan's cabin sat a few miles outside town, tucked between the woods and an open meadow. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything he needed. He had built most of it himself after leaving the military. There was a wide porch with a rocking chair and a small wooden sign near the steps that read home. He didn't need more than that. After years of constant movement and danger, peace was worth more than anything. Inside, the sound of paws echoed on the floorboards. Ranger, his Belgian Malinois, stretched and wagged his tail. The dog's sharp eyes followed Ethan as he poured coffee into an old metal mug. Ethan smiled, setting the mug down before crouching to scratch behind Ranger's ears. "Morning, partner," he said softly. Ranger barked once, tail thumping. They had been through everything together, training, long nights, impossible missions, and the kind of silence that only soldiers understand. Ethan often thought Ranger understood him better than most people ever had. The dog had been trained to detect danger, to protect, and to obey, but now he was just Ethan's best friend. Out here, he didn't have to be a soldier. He could just be a dog. After breakfast, Ethan stepped outside with Ranger. The world was still waking up. The first sunlight hit the tops of the trees, turning the leaves gold. Ranger ran ahead into the tall grass, his muscles moving like a shadow against the light. Ethan watched, feeling something that was close to happiness. A quiet, steady peace he hadn't felt in years. He walked down the dirt path leading to a small pond behind the property. The path was lined with wildflowers and stones that he and Ranger had collected during their walks. Every morning they followed the same route, no matter the weather. Routine helped Ethan keep his mind still. After so many years of chaos, the rhythm of ordinary life felt sacred. When they reached the pond, Ranger jumped into the shallow water with a joyful splash. Ethan chuckled, tossing a stick for him to fetch. It was small moments like this that reminded him of what he had fought for all those years. The right to live freely, to feel the morning sun, to laugh at a dog being silly. No medals could ever compare. By mid-morning, Ethan was already busy with chores. He repaired fences, cleaned tools, and checked the small vegetable garden behind the cabin. He liked working with his hands, the feel of soil, the sound of a hammer striking wood. It reminded him that he was building something real, not just surviving. Ranger stayed close, sometimes lying in the grass, other times trotting along the fence line, keeping watch like it was still his duty. Around noon, Ethan drove into town for supplies. The drive was peaceful. Long stretches of open road, the hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of Ranger's breathing in the back seat. The town was small, the kind where everyone knew each other's names. A gas station, a diner, a post office, and a few small shops lined the main street. Nothing about it seemed extraordinary, and that's exactly what Ethan loved. When he parked near the general store, a few locals waved. He gave them a small nod. He wasn't unfriendly, just quiet. Most of the townspeople thought he was some sort of construction worker or maybe an ex-farmer. Nobody asked too many questions, and Ethan liked it that way. The fewer people who knew about his past, the better. Inside the store, the owner, an older man named Harold, smiled as Ethan walked in. "Morning, Ethan. You and that dog of yours doing okay?" "Doing good, Harold," Ethan said, picking up a bag of dog food and a few groceries. "Good to hear. That's one smart dog you got there. Folks around here could use a bit of his discipline," Harold joked. Ethan smiled slightly. "Yeah, he's one of a kind." As he walked back to the truck, a few kids passing by stopped to pet Ranger through the open window. The dog stayed calm, tail wagging slowly. Ethan waited, letting them enjoy the moment. He liked seeing people smile around Ranger. It reminded him that not all memories had to be heavy. Back at home, Ethan spent the afternoon fixing a broken gate. The air was warm and the sky was clear. Ranger lay nearby, watching every move. Sometimes Ethan talked to him while he worked. "You think this will hold up through winter, boy?" he'd ask. Ranger would tilt his head like he was considering the question. It made Ethan laugh every time. Evenings were his favorite. He'd sit on the porch, drink a cup of coffee, and watch the sunset burn across the sky. Ranger would lie at his feet, eyes scanning the horizon. They didn't need words. The silence between them was comfortable. After years of missions where silence meant danger, it now meant peace. Sometimes memories crept in. The faces of teammates, the sounds of gunfire, the long nights under foreign skies. He didn't try to push them away. Instead, he let them pass through him like waves that came and went. Ranger would always sense it moving closer, resting his head on Ethan's knee. That simple gesture was enough to bring him back to the present. At night, the cabin grew quiet again. The soft hum of crickets outside filled the darkness. Ethan sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall over the fields. He often thought about how strange life could be. One moment, you're halfway across the world fighting for something bigger than yourself, and the next, you're just trying to grow tomatoes and fix fences. But that was life. Change was the only constant. The next few days passed in a steady rhythm. Mornings with coffee and walks, afternoons with work, evenings with quiet. The world outside his land moved fast, people rushing, fighting, arguing. But here time slowed down. Sometimes he'd take the truck and drive into the woods just to sit under the trees. He said little prayers there. Not the kind you say in church, but the kind that live deep in your heart. Gratitude for peace. Gratitude for the dog beside him. Gratitude for another sunrise. One weekend, a small storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, rain beating against the cabin roof. Ranger hated thunder, so Ethan sat with him on the floor until it passed. He whispered, "It's okay, buddy. We've been through worse." Ranger pressed closer, trembling slightly, but calmed at the sound of his voice. Ethan smiled faintly. "You saved my life more times than I can count," he said quietly. "Least I can do is help you through a storm." When the storm ended, the world looked clean again. The grass shone with drops of water and the air smelled fresh. Ethan stood outside looking over his land. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was his. He had earned it, not through luck but through endurance. One afternoon, a delivery truck stopped by. The driver, a young man new to the area, looked nervous as Ranger barked from the porch. Ethan waved to reassure him. "He won't bite," he said. "He's all bark." The driver laughed awkwardly, handing over a package. "That's good to hear. Big fella, though." "Yeah," Ethan said, patting Ranger's head. "He used to be in the service." "Oh, really?" the driver asked, curiosity in his voice. "Yeah," Ethan said simply, signing the receipt. "We both did." The driver nodded, unsure what to say. "Well, thank you for your service." Ethan gave a small smile. "Take care on the road." After the truck left, Ethan opened the package. It was a new leash for Ranger, a simple one made of sturdy leather. He held it in his hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Small things like that meant something to him. They were reminders of loyalty and trust, values that had guided his entire life. As days turned into weeks, Ethan began to feel truly settled. He fixed up an old barn on the property, turning it into a small workshop. Sometimes he built furniture to pass the time, gifting chairs or tables to neighbors who needed them. People started calling him the quiet handyman, and though he didn't talk much, everyone respected him. Ranger became a familiar sight around town. When Ethan went for supplies, people would smile and wave, and kids would run up to pet him. He was gentle with them, patient and calm. Some folks said it was like he could sense who needed comfort. In many ways, Ranger wasn't just Ethan's companion. He was a bridge between Ethan and the world he had once left behind. One evening, Ethan sat by the fire, an old photo album in his lap. Ranger lay beside him, half asleep. The photos were from years ago. Teammates in uniform, dusty roads, distant lands. He touched one photo where Ranger stood beside him, both younger, eyes sharper, ready for anything. "You've still got that same look," he said softly. "Guess some things never change." He closed the album, leaned back and stared into the fire. The flames danced, lighting the room with a soft orange glow. For a moment he thought about how easily this piece could disappear, how fragile life really was. He didn't know that soon. Everything he had built would be tested. But for now, he was content. The world outside didn't matter. The only sound he needed was the steady breathing of the dog sleeping beside him. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching at a sound outside. Just the wind, maybe a raccoon. He settled back down. The cabin returned to stillness, wrapped in the quiet safety of a place they both called home. For Ethan Cole, peace wasn't a word, it was a daily choice. He had seen the worst of the world, and decided to build something better in his little corner of it. He didn't talk about the medals tucked away in a box or the memories that sometimes woke him at night. He just lived one quiet morning at a time, beside the only friend who had never left his side. And as the stars spread across the dark sky, the two of them, a man and his dog, slept soundly, unaware that the calm life they cherished was standing at the edge of a storm that neither of them could yet see. The morning started like any other. The air was soft and cool and the world seemed calm. Ethan Cole stood on his porch with a cup of coffee in hand, looking at the mist lifting off the fields. Ranger was lying at his feet, eyes half closed, enjoying the peace of the early hour. It was one of those quiet mornings that made Ethan feel like he had finally left the noise of the world behind. He took a slow sip of coffee, watching as Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of a distant bird. "You hear that?" Ethan said, smiling. "That's the sound of a calm day." The dog wagged his tail once, as if agreeing. After breakfast, Ethan got ready to go into town. He needed a few supplies and had promised a neighbor he'd help fix a broken fence. He packed a few tools into his truck and called to Ranger. "Stay here, boy. I'll be back in a few hours." Ranger whined softly but obeyed. Ethan gave him a pat on the head before driving down the dirt road that led to town. The tires kicked up dust and the sound faded into the distance. For a while, everything was as it always was, quiet and steady. Back at the cabin, Ranger wandered around the yard. He sniffed the grass, trotted along the fence line, and lay in his favorite spot under the big oak tree. It was his normal routine. He wasn't a dog that liked trouble. He stayed close to home, loyal and calm. Around noon, the sound of another vehicle came down the road, a white truck belonging to the local animal control officers. Inside were two new officers who had just transferred to the area. They had received a call earlier that morning from someone in town reporting a large, aggressive dog roaming the outskirts near Ethan's property. In truth, Ranger hadn't done anything wrong. He had chased a stray raccoon earlier and might have been seen near the fence line, but sometimes in small towns rumors grow faster than facts. The officers pulled up to the gate looking around. One of them, the younger one, frowned. "That's a big dog," he said, spotting Ranger lying near the porch. The older officer nodded. "Yeah, let's check the report. Says the dog was off leash and acting hostile. They didn't see a leash and they didn't see Ethan. They didn't even bother to look for a house number or leave a note. Instead, they stepped out of the truck, their boots crunching on the gravel." Ranger stood up, alert but calm, tail raised slightly. He barked once, not in anger but in warning. He had been trained to guard, not to harm. The officers froze. The younger one muttered, "He's barking. That's a threat." The older one said quietly, "We better be careful." Ranger stayed in place, watching. He didn't move closer. He wasn't used to strangers walking onto the property without Ethan's presence. But to the officers, his training, his stillness, his focus, all looked intimidating. They didn't understand what they were seeing. As one of them reached for something on his belt, Ranger barked again, louder this time. His instincts told him something wasn't right. But in that moment, confusion and fear took over the officer's judgment. What happened next was a mistake, a chain of poor choices made in seconds. The sound that broke the calm of that quiet road would later echo in Ethan's memory for the rest of his life. When the noise faded, the officers stood in silence. The younger one's hands were shaking. "What did we just do?" he whispered. The older one stared at the ground, his face pale. Let's file the report," he said, his voice tight. "We'll say the dog charged. They didn't check for a tag. They didn't notice the small sign by the porch that read, 'Trained Service Animal.' They just left, leaving behind the kind of silence that carries the weight of something irreversible." Hours later, Ethan drove back up the dirt road, humming softly to himself. The sun was beginning to set and golden light filled the trees. He could already picture Ranger waiting by the porch, tail wagging, ready to greet him like always. But when he turned the corner, the scene didn't look right. The front gate was slightly open, and there were fresh tire marks in the dirt. His heart tightened. He parked quickly and stepped out. "Ranger?" he called out. No answer. Only the sound of wind moving through the grass. He walked toward the porch, calling again, louder this time. "Ranger!" The stillness that followed was unbearable. Then he saw, near the side of the yard under the oak tree, the shape lying motionless in the grass. For a moment, He didn't move. His mind refused to believe what his eyes were seeing. Then he dropped everything and ran. When he reached Ranger's side, he knelt down, hands trembling. Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. He touched the dog's fur, still warm from the sun but lifeless. There were no signs of a struggle, just stillness. Ethan sat there for a long time, not saying a word. The quiet hurt more than any sound could. The man who had faced war zones and loss 100 times over now sat frozen, staring at the one companion who had given him peace. It wasn't anger that filled him at first, and it was disbelief, a hollow emptiness that made his hands shake. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over. "I should have been here." As the sun disappeared and the shadows stretched across the yard, he gently lifted Ranger's body and carried him to the porch. He wrapped him in an old blanket, the one they used during cold nights. His steps were slow, careful, respectful. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat on the porch staring into the dark, his mind spinning. He thought of all the mornings they had shared, the walks, the quiet moments by the pond. Every memory felt sharper now, like glass cutting through the calm he had built. He didn't know what had happened yet. There was no note, no explanation, only silence. The next morning, Ethan went into town, his face pale and eyes hollow. He walked into the sheriff's office, calm but cold. "Something happened at my property yesterday," he said quietly. The deputy looked up. "What kind of something?" "My dog's gone," Ethan said, voice steady. "And someone was there. Tire tracks, gate open. I want to know who it was." The deputy nodded slowly. "We'll look into it." "Maybe animal control." "Animal control?" Ethan interrupted, his voice tightening. "Why would they come to my property?" The deputy hesitated. "There was a call about a dog running loose in that area. Might have been a misunderstanding." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. "A misunderstanding?" The deputy looked uncomfortable. "I can check the report. But if it was them, they were just doing their job." Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just said quietly, "Their job was to protect, not destroy." Then he turned and walked out. Outside, the town looked the same as always. People chatting, cars passing, kids playing. But for Ethan, everything had changed. Every sound felt distant, like he was standing in another world entirely. He spent the next few hours walking the property again, searching for clues. He found shell casings near the fence, marked with numbers from government-issued rounds. That told him everything he needed to know. He sat on the ground beside the oak tree and whispered, "They didn't even know who you were, did they? You saved lives and they treated you like nothing." His hand rested on the earth. "I'll make it right. I promise." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something inside him stir. Not the rage of a soldier, but the quiet resolve of a man who had seen too much injustice to ignore it. He made a simple wooden cross that evening. He carved Ranger's name into it with a steady hand, then placed it under the oak tree where they had spent so many mornings. As he stood there, the wind rustled through the leaves, and he could almost hear the soft jingle of Ranger's collar. Neighbors noticed the change in him in the days that followed. He still helped people, still went to town, but he spoke less and smiled rarely. When someone asked about the dog, he just said, "He's gone," and walked away. A few days later, a letter came from the county office confirming that animal control had visited his property. The explanation was short, almost careless. Standard procedure. The animal was reported as aggressive and unrestrained. No apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake. Ethan folded the letter and placed it on the table. For a long time, he stared at it without moving. Then he stood, walked outside, and looked toward the horizon. The peaceful life he had built now carried a shadow. He didn't shout or curse. He didn't plan revenge. But deep inside, something began to shift. The quiet precision of a man who knew how to find truth when others tried to hide it. He wasn't going to fight anyone. He was going to uncover what really happened. For now, though, he stayed by the oak tree each evening, sitting beside the small wooden cross. He talked softly, like Ranger could still hear him. "You always protected me," he said one night. "Now it's my turn." The crickets sang in the background and the air grew cooler. The stars came out one by one. Ethan leaned back against the tree, eyes closed. The calm he once had was gone, replaced by purpose, quiet, controlled, and unstoppable. And as the night deepened, he knew that this was only the beginning. What had started as a tragic mistake would soon lead him down a path that no one in that small town could ever have imagined. Days turned into weeks, but the ache in Ethan's heart didn't fade. The house felt empty now. Every time he opened the door, he half expected to hear Ranger's paws tapping on the floor, or see his head lift from his bed near the fireplace. But there was only silence, the kind of silence that followed you around like a shadow. Ethan tried to keep himself busy. He worked on the fences, cut firewood, and fixed the roof of the old shed. But no matter what he did, he couldn't fill the space Ranger had left behind. Every task felt heavier, slower. Some days he would still catch himself setting out 2 bowls in the kitchen, before remembering there was no reason to. He'd stop, stare for a moment, then quietly put 1 bowl away. The letter from the county office sat on the table. He'd read it over and over until he knew every word by heart. It said very little, just that the incident was under review and that proper procedures were followed. Those words sounded cold, distant, as if what had happened was nothing more than paperwork. But to Ethan, it wasn't just paperwork. It was a life. It was his closest friend. At first, he tried to let it go. He told himself there was no point in stirring trouble, that maybe it had just been a mistake. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something wasn't right. The officers hadn't left a report at his home. No one had come to speak with him directly. It was as if they wanted the whole thing to disappear quietly. That thought didn't sit well with Ethan. He had spent most of his life in places where truth was hidden behind layers of lies. He knew the signs. He could sense when people were covering something up. He didn't need a uniform or a weapon to see through deception. He had learned that long ago. So one morning he put on his old denim jacket, grabbed the folded letter, and drove to the county building. It was a small place with faded paint and a flag fluttering in the breeze. Inside, a few clerks sat behind desks typing away. He walked to the front counter. "Can I help you?" the woman behind the desk asked politely. "I'm here about a report," Ethan said, handing her the letter. "My dog was put down by animal control a few weeks ago. I'd like to see the full incident file." She looked at the paper, then at him. "I'm not sure if we can release that without authorization." "Whose authorization?" Ethan asked quietly. She hesitated. "You'd have to speak with the department head." "He's out right now." Ethan gave a short nod. "I'll wait." He sat in one of the plastic chairs by the wall. Minutes turned into an hour. He didn't mind. Waiting was something he had learned to do very well. Eventually, a man in a buttoned shirt walked in holding a cup of coffee. The clerk whispered something to him and handed him Ethan's letter. The man scanned it quickly, then walked over. "You must be Mr. Cole," he said with a polite smile. "I'm sorry about your loss. It's always hard losing a pet." Ethan looked up at him. He wasn't just a pet. He was a service dog. The man's smile faded slightly. "I understand. The report says there was confusion. The officers believed the animal was unrestrained and possibly aggressive." "Did you read the report?" Ethan asked. The man blinked. "Well, I reviewed the summary. I'd like to see the full report," Ethan said. The man hesitated. "That information isn't typically shared with the public." "I'm not the public," Ethan said quietly. "I'm the owner. I have a right to know what happened." The man looked uncomfortable. "I'll have to check what can be released." Ethan nodded once. "You do that. I'll be back tomorrow." He turned and walked out. That evening, he sat on his porch, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. He thought about the conversation. It reminded him of briefings from years ago, when officials spoke in circles to avoid admitting the truth. He had seen that pattern too many times. The next morning, he drove back to the county building. This time, the same man looked nervous. "Mr. Cole, I did some checking," he said. "I can give you a redacted copy of the incident summary." He handed Ethan a few pages. Most of the words were blacked out, but a few lines stood out clearly. "Responded to complaint of loose dog near rural property. Dog barked and approached officers. Standard action taken. Standard action." Ethan read those words again and again. They sounded like a machine had written them in a cold. Without feeling, without truth, he folded the paper, looked at the man and said quietly, "There was nothing standard about what they did." When he left the office, he didn't feel angry. He just felt certain that there was more to uncover. That night, he started making calls. Old habits came back naturally, calm, methodical, precise. He contacted a friend who had once worked in law enforcement, another who now worked in state administration. He didn't tell them everything, just asked small questions. Who oversees county animal control? What's the process after a use of force report? How are complaints reviewed? Bit by bit, he began to piece things together. He learned that the officers involved were new. One had only been on the job for a few months. The other had faced a complaint in a neighboring county for excessive response, but had never been disciplined. Ethan also found out that the department had no body camera policy for animal calls. There was no footage, no record, only their word. That realization struck him deeply. Without proof, the truth could easily vanish. He spent nights at his desk, reading, making notes. He wasn't doing it for revenge. He wasn't trying to make headlines. He just wanted honesty, a simple acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. He began keeping a journal, something he hadn't done in years. In it, he wrote about Ranger, the small memories, the lessons, the bond they shared. Writing helped him stay grounded. It reminded him why he was doing this. Sometimes he would drive out to the oak tree and sit by the small cross he had made. He'd talk softly, telling Ranger what he'd learned. "They're trying to hide it," he said one evening. "But I'll find the truth. You'd do the same for me." As word spread through town, people began to notice. A few neighbors stopped by to offer their condolences. Some had heard whispers about what had happened. "That wasn't right," one of them said quietly. "They shouldn't have gone on your land without you there." Ethan just nodded. He wasn't looking for sympathy, only understanding. One afternoon, an older woman from town, someone who volunteered at the local shelter, visited. She brought a small stack of papers. "I thought you might want to see this," she said. "It's a copy of the call log from that day. I got it through a friend." Ethan thanked her and read through the pages. The original call came from someone a few miles away who had reported a brown dog chasing something near the woods. That was it. No mention of aggression, no harm done. Yet somehow the report that reached the officers had changed. That was the moment Ethan knew there was more going on than a simple mistake. He decided to keep digging, quietly. He didn't tell many people what he was doing. He didn't want attention. He just wanted accountability. He visited the local newspaper office one morning and asked to speak with a reporter. The young journalist looked surprised. "Mr. Cole, I've heard about what happened. Do you want to go on record?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "I just want you to look into it. Ask questions. Why didn't they follow procedure? Why did the report change?" The reporter agreed to check. Ethan thanked him and left, walking down the quiet street. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in town began to shift. People started talking, not loudly but enough to make those responsible uneasy. The story reached neighboring communities. Others came forward with small complaints about mishandled situations. Through it all, Ethan stayed calm. He still worked, still helped neighbors fix things, still waved to people in town. But behind that calm was a quiet determination. At night, when he sat by the fire, he often thought about what Ranger had taught him. Loyalty, patience, courage. "You never gave up," he'd whisper. "So I won't either." The process was slow, but truth has a way of finding cracks to slip through. One morning, the same reporter he'd met weeks earlier called. "Mr. Cole, we found something," he said. The officers didn't log the visit properly. "There's a missing hour in their GPS records." Ethan closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "Thank you," he said simply. He didn't celebrate. He didn't tell anyone. He just sat on the porch that evening, watching the sky fade from gold to deep blue. He felt something he hadn't in weeks. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. The next day, the newspaper published a small article. It didn't name names, but it questioned the department's transparency. The story spread quietly through social media. People started asking questions. Officials began to issue cautious statements about reviewing policies. For Ethan, it wasn't enough yet. But it was a start. He knew there would be more resistance, more attempts to bury the truth. But he also knew something else. Once the truth begins to surface, it's hard to stop it. Each evening, he'd visit Ranger's resting place. The grass had started to grow back around the small cross. He'd sit there and talk softly. "We're getting there," he said one night. One step at a time. He didn't raise his voice or demand anything. He just kept moving, steady and quiet like he always had. The man who had once fought in distant lands was now fighting for something smaller, but just as important. Not through force, not through anger, but through truth, patience, and love for the only companion who had ever truly understood him. As the days grew shorter and the air turned colder, Ethan knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But he also knew that the truth, once awakened, has a power of its own. And deep inside, he felt something that had been missing for a long time. Not peace, but a sense of direction. A reason to keep going, for Ranger. Ethan Cole had always believed that truth had its own way of surfacing, even if people tried to bury it. Weeks had passed since the article in the local paper came out, and though it was small, it had started something that couldn't be ignored. People in town began whispering, sharing bits of what they knew. Questions spread faster than anyone expected. At first, the county officials acted calm, pretending nothing was wrong. They released short statements saying they were looking into procedural concerns. But inside their offices, the mood was tense. The quiet man who had lived on the edge of town, the man nobody really knew, had become the center of something much bigger than anyone had imagined. Ethan didn't want fame. He didn't even want attention. He only wanted honesty. He didn't expect much from the world anymore, but he believed the truth deserved to be heard. Each morning, he still followed his usual routine. He woke before sunrise, made coffee, and sat on the porch with his notebook. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, notes, dates, and small details he'd uncovered about the case. But between those lines, there were also quiet thoughts about Ranger. Memories written not to share, but to keep something alive. One morning as he sat there, his phone rang. It was the young reporter again. "Mr. Cole," the voice said, "I think you should know. The State Oversight Board has requested all the animal control files from this county. They're opening an inquiry." Ethan took a slow breath. "That's good," he said softly. "It's about time." It wasn't victory he felt, but relief. The kind that came from knowing that someone somewhere was finally paying attention. Later that day, a black sedan pulled up near his gate. A woman stepped out wearing a plain gray jacket and holding a small folder. She introduced herself as part of the state review team. "Mr. Cole, we're reviewing the events that took place on your property. I'd like to hear your version of what happened." Ethan invited her to the porch. He spoke calmly without anger. He told her everything from the start. How he'd left for town that morning, how he came home to find the gate open, and how the officers never contacted him afterward. He showed her the letter, the call log, and the redacted report. She listened carefully, taking notes. When he finished, she closed the folder and said quietly, "I'm sorry for your loss. I can't promise what the final outcome will be, but your story matters." After she left, Ethan sat for a while, staring at the horizon. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes right before change. He felt something shift inside him. For the first time, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, the system that had failed him was starting to wake up. A few days later, he went into town for supplies. People looked at him differently now, not out of pity, but respect. The store owner, Harold, waved him over. "Heard they're finally doing something about what happened," Harold said. "You started all this, you know." Ethan gave a small smile. "I didn't start anything," he replied. "I just told the truth." But inside he knew Harold was right. His quiet persistence had forced something to move. That evening, when he got home, he found a letter in the mailbox. It was from the state office. Inside was a short note confirming that the officers involved had been suspended pending review. The department was also under audit for policy violations. Ethan read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. He didn't feel joy, only quiet satisfaction. It wasn't revenge he wanted. It was accountability. As the investigation deepened, more stories came to light. Other residents came forward with their own experiences. Lost pets, unreturned calls, careless actions. The pattern became clear. The issue wasn't just one mistake. It was a system that had grown careless. The newspaper published another article, this time with more detail. It didn't mention Ethan by name, but everyone in town knew who it was about. People stopped him on the street to say thank you. Some said, "You did what none of us could." He would just nod and say, "I did what was right." At night, Ethan continued visiting Ranger's resting place under the oak tree. The grass had grown tall and soft, and sometimes the wind would rustle the branches like a whisper. He'd sit there and talk quietly. "We're getting closer," he'd say. "They're finally listening." But even as things began to move in his favor, Ethan's heart still felt heavy. The truth didn't bring Ranger back. The cabin was still quiet. Every morning he still looked toward the porch, half expecting to see his friend waiting. One chilly morning while he was chopping wood, a small pickup truck pulled up the drive. It was the same young reporter who had been helping him. He stepped out with a smile. "I thought I'd give you this," he said, handing Ethan a newspaper. The headline read, "County Animal Control under full state investigation." "They're talking about changing the entire department structure," the reporter said. "Mandatory training, stricter oversight, all of it. You made a difference." Ethan looked at the paper quietly. "I just wanted them to tell the truth," he said. "Well," the reporter replied, "sometimes the truth does more than we think." After the reporter left, Ethan sat on the porch holding the paper in his hands. He thought about how far things had come, from that first quiet day to this moment. It felt strange, almost unreal. He had never sought attention, yet somehow his story had become a turning point for others. Later that week, a letter arrived from the state investigator he had met. It was written in simple words, "The case is closed. The officer's actions were found to be unjustified. Policy reform is in process." Ethan read the letter slowly, letting the words sink in. There it was, the truth, clear and official. The fight was over. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan walked to the oak tree. The air was cool, the sky streaked with shades of gold and purple. He sat down beside the small wooden cross and laid the letter next to it. "We did it," he whispered. They admitted it. The wind rustled through the leaves as if answering him. He sat there for a long time, remembering everything. The good days, the quiet mornings, the long walks, and the laughter that used to fill the air. He smiled softly through the ache. "You'd have been proud, buddy," he said. The following days were quieter. The news spread, and soon people from other towns reached out. Some sent letters, others dropped by his porch to thank him. One family told him that because of the new policy changes, their service dog training program had received new support. Ethan listened quietly, humbled, but even with the attention he stayed the same. Calm, quiet, focused. He didn't want credit or reward. What mattered most to him was that Ranger's story had brought change. That his friend's life, though short, had made the world a little better. A few weeks later, the county invited Ethan to a small ceremony. They were naming a new community initiative for service animals, a program to train officers in handling and respecting trained dogs. It would be called Ranger's Law. When they told him, he didn't know what to say at first. He simply nodded, his throat tight. "That's kind," he managed to whisper. At the ceremony, a few people gave short speeches. There was a small crowd, quiet and respectful. When they handed Ethan a plaque with Ranger's name on it, he held it gently, almost afraid to let his emotions show. He spoke only a few words. "He was my partner," Ethan said softly. "He saved lives and gave me peace. I didn't fight for revenge. I fought because loyalty deserves truth. Thank you for giving him that." The crowd stood in silence, then clapped, not loudly, but with the kind of respect that comes from genuine feeling. After the ceremony, Ethan drove home, the plaque resting on the seat beside him. He placed it inside the cabin on the mantel above the fireplace. Then he sat in his chair, staring at the quiet room. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like closure. That night, as he stepped outside, the moon was bright. The fields glowed silver in the soft light. He walked to the oak tree again, the air cool and still. He placed his hand on the wooden cross and said, "Your name's out there now. People will remember." A soft breeze moved through the branches, and Ethan smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that came from happiness. More like peace finally finding a way back into his heart. In the following days, he went back to his routine, tending to the garden, fixing things, helping neighbors. But there was something new in his life now. He began volunteering with a local veterans group, helping them train dogs for emotional support. When one of the dogs looked up at him with trusting eyes, something inside him healed a little more. The town began to change too. People talked more openly about kindness, responsibility, and respect. The officers who replaced the old ones came to meet Ethan in person. They shook his hand and thanked him for what he'd done. "We'll do better," one of them said. Ethan believed him. He had learned that change, even slow change, was worth fighting for. Months passed and life found its rhythm again. Seasons shifted, the fields turned green, then golden. The oak tree stood tall as ever, watching over the small wooden cross. Ethan still visited every evening, not out of grief anymore, but out of gratitude. Sometimes he would sit there for hours thinking about everything.